we've admonished our speakers today to not get too wonky, because it is kind of a wonky subject matter that we're covering today, but it's also really interesting and has the capacity, as you'll learn, to really do a lot to address the affordability needs for low-income residents of communities. Our talk today kind of falls into three chunks. There'll be a discussion about the most recent effort in Sacramento, which was led by Assemblymember Bloom from Santa Monica to sort of re-establish the capacity for local jurisdictions to adopt and use inclusionary zoning ordinances. There'll be a discussion from three communities in our region that have inclusionary programs that are alive and well. There will be a discussion from the market rate community talking about sort of how they deal with those kinds and how they think about those kinds of policies. And then we'll wrap up the formal presentations with some folks who are in the business of consulting local jurisdictions on policies like these. And then we'll open it up for questions and answers. So, you know, as you all know, the story of inclusionary zoning has a long and storied past. There's about 170 cities in California that have some form of inclusionary program. In about 2009, a big market rate developer in downtown LA sued and was successful at getting essentially a moratorium on inclusionary ordinances, although I think some cities figured out how to keep going. 2005, some courts up in Northern California said that, gosh, you know, we think that in a single-family context, inclusionary might be okay, and then culminating in a work that concluded in September of this year, the folks in Sacramento changed the law to make it possible. And so, just a reminder to, well, just real quick, I forgot to do the commercial. So the Southern California Association of Nonprofit Housing is a member organization that represents people who are in the business of developing and operating homes for low-income people. We operate throughout Southern California, and I was really pleased when sometime towards the end of the year last year, Bill Long for the city of Pasadena, who's really our host today, called up and said, hey, let's do something to really you know, springboard the work that's happened in Sacramento and talk a little about inclusionary programs and how they can be effective. And so I think what we're going to do right this very second, I'm going to give Bill a chance to say hello when his turn on the agenda comes, so why don't we wait a minute. But I think what I want to do right now is introduce a member of the staff for Assemblymember Bloom, who really was the champion in Sacramento to pass the law, AB 1505, I think it was, to sort of correct and create clarity around the capacity to implement and impose and implement inclusionary programs. So that speaker will be Tim Harder, who's the senior staff representative for Assemblymember Bloom. Assemblymember Bloom, he represents Assemblymember Bloom at meetings and community events. And prior to joining the Assemblymember's office, Tim worked at the Arizona State Legislature, handling constituent affairs. Tim is from Arizona, but is currently living in Santa Monica, which is probably a good thing given where his boss represents. And without further ado, please, Tim.
Hi, can everyone hear me? Awesome. My name is Tim Harder. I work for Assemblymember Bloom, and we're going to talk a little bit about the Palmer fix. Before we did that, though, I thought that we should all talk about what is inclusionary housing, because there might be some people that know what it's about. So, inclusionary housing is promoting the inclusion of housing units that are affordable for moderate and low-income households in new residential projects by providing incentives and cost offsets to developers. In practice, inclusionary housing policies usually involve placing deed restrictions on 10 to 30% of new houses or apartments in order to make costs of the housing affordable to lower-income households. So this engages the private sector in affordable housing solutions by offering financial and other incentives, basically. So why use it? It helps prevent or slow the dislocation caused by gentrification, helps maintain both economic and racial diversity. It increases housing choices for families earning below the area median income. This also increases low-income families' access to opportunities such as schools, comprehensive transit systems, and safe streets. And so we thought about what we could do to help with inclusionary housing. As I mentioned, some communities were still using it, but we really need to make it so that it was the law that you could use it. So Palmer versus City of LA, in 2009, the California Court of Appeals preempted local inclusionary housing ordinances for rent construction when it sided with developer Jeff Palmer in Palmer versus City of LA. The inclusionary housing ordinance required by the city violated the Costa-Hawkins Act, which effectively bans rent control in new rental units. This ruling ended up cutting off local government's ability to apply inclusionary policies to rental housing. Since 2009 up until 2017, cities and counties in California have only enforced inclusionary housing ordinances in for-sale units. So the governor was not going to touch it until the courts decided on that Supreme Court, until it got to Supreme Court. So it comes on the heels of the 2015 ruling of the California Supreme Court in the Building Industry Association versus City of San Jose, which strongly upheld the ability of local governments to adopt inclusionary housing ordinances. The court found the objective increase the amount of affordable housing in the city and of locating such housing in economically diverse development are unquestionably constitutional permissible purposes. AB 1505, also known as the Palmer Fix, is narrowly focused on allowing local inclusionary policies to acquire the provision of affordable rental housing, if so desired locally, effectively restoring laws that stood prior to 2009. So basically, this is not making it so that cities have to do inclusionary housing. This is giving tools to local municipalities, letting them choose if it's best for their city to implement inclusionary housing in their zoning. AB 15 requires cities and counties to provide alternate means of compliance that may include in lieu fees, land dedication, off-site construction, or acquisition and reposition of existing units. For example, if there's a building being built and there's not enough space to put all the inclusionary units, they can purchase it off-site if that is an agreement that's made with the city. It happens a lot in a couple of the cities that you'll hear from later. In addition, cities and counties have not submitted their annual housing element reports or not meet at least 75% of their regional housing needs allocation. These are known as the RENA goals for above moderate income housing. AB 1505 authorizes the California Department of Housing and Community Development to review any ordinance adopted or amended after September 15, 2017. That requires more than 15% of the total number of units in a rental housing development to be affordable. So basically what that means is if a city decides to come in and say that they're going to require 50% inclusionary housing units in their complex and then no housing gets built in the city, if they're not meeting the RENA goals after a couple of years, the state's going to step in and say, basically construction stopped and you're not, you need to be getting back on track. So pursuant to such review, HCD may require an economic feasibility study, meaning qualified standards to establish that inclusionary ordinances not unduly constrain housing production. There will be other things that will be taken into consideration, so it's not going to be if the economy comes into play, or if it's lawsuits happening in the city, or other factors will be taken into consideration. It won't just be that if you're not making your inclusionary housing units, the state's going to come down on you. Everything will be taken into account. Define affordability. Affordable rent and utilities or mortgage taxes and utilities cost 30% or less of the gross household income. So if households spend not more than 30% of their gross income on housing that costs more than 30% of their gross income, substantially strain the household budget, which also pay for transportation costs, food, and other needs. The AMI, the area median income, is a good indicator of households' buying power. It's a dollar amount where half the population earns less and half earns more. Households earning less than AMI frequently struggle to find good housing options that work within their budgets. The rapidly escalating housing market has priced out more and more households from neighborhoods they work in and want to live in. So we have the 50th Assembly District, and I thought it'd be interesting just to show those numbers of AMIs in the 50th Assembly District. So these are AMIs in our district, everything ranging from a few cities you might have heard: Malibu, Santa Monica, West Hollywood, Beverly Hills. People are being priced out of our district extremely fast. In the past 5 years, Assemblymember Bloom and our office has really realized that housing is really taking a big effect in our district, so that's why we worked on inclusionary housing. So how it works, major components of inclusionary housing require housing developers to price some units so they are affordable to moderate and low-income households. As I mentioned earlier, provide developers with cost offsets and bonuses to compensate for revenues lost by making some units affordable. Usually run by the local government, but there are cases in which the program is run by a nonprofit housing agency or a community land trust. Key elements of inclusionary housing: define affordability, set AMI limits. Specify the affordable housing set aside that will be required of residential development projects. Determine alternatives to construction of affordable units. Will you have a fee in lieu of construction, land transfer, off-site construction? These are all options that you can do at your own local level. Cost offsets include density bonus, transfer of development rights, land donation by the city, reduced parking requirements, which LA is starting to play with around their TODs, transit-oriented developments, property or sales tax abatement, low interest loan to the developer, and reduced development fees, as well as expedited permitting. So I just want to you're going to hear later, but I just want to point out a couple quick inclusionary housing success stories. Montgomery County in Maryland, they were the first in the country to have inclusionary housing. Between 1976 to 2016, they had almost 15,000 affordable units generated in that time period. Affordable for 30 years ownership units and 99 years for rentals. You can see some of the city discretions there, what they do with developers, program structure. Again, everyone does it differently, so it just depends on what's best for your local area. A couple of California populations in Davis, California. Between 1990 and 2011, there were 1,800 affordable units generated. Permanent affordability on rental units, 40 to 80% area median income for rental units. Again, you'll hear later from some of these cities, but some cities have such high area median incomes that you need to have these higher percentage numbers. Petaluma, California, population of 60,000, 1,300 affordable units. They changed it a little bit different over there. Developers receive 5 to 35% density bonuses. You can see the sort of population of that. And then fee in lieu, $2,400 to $22,000 a unit. If you decide not to build the affordable housing, that money basically goes into a fund that the city operates and can build affordable housing. So in conclusion, the goal is to increase affordable housing choices and create economically diverse neighborhoods. So a couple things you can do: support inclusionary housing in your community. Again, this just got enacted on January 1st, so about 3 weeks ago. So this is now a new thing for local municipalities to have. You can learn more about how to draft inclusionary policy at that website, and I can send it to you all later. And then it helps you design a policy for your cities and helps you advocate for inclusionary housing in your community. And that's my contact information. I just want to point out that our door is always open. We're always thinking of innovative solutions for the housing crisis. If you have ideas, Assemblymember Bloom is always interested in those ideas. I want to point out, I appreciate Bill and the city of Pasadena and Santa Monica and West Hollywood and other cities for doing their part on inclusionary housing, because we all need to do our part, and that's what we're all here for today. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Tim. Appreciate it. I'm not going to mess with this. Thank you. So our next, so now we're going to transition from the law to looking at some cities in our region who have been effectively implementing programs like this. So we're going to start with City of Pasadena, our host today, and I'm going to introduce Bill Wong, the Director of Pasadena Housing. He oversees the city's affordable housing development, their inclusionary program, first-time homebuyer program, Section 8, community development block grant, and career services programs. Bill has long tenured in the affordable housing world in LA, having worked for a developer. He's an architect, and actually at some point sat on the SCAMP board, I believe. So please welcome Bill Wong.
Okay, well, thank you all for being here. It's great to see the interest in inclusionary housing, and we hope that many other cities who are considering inclusionary housing that have strong multifamily development markets would really think hard about adopting an inclusionary ordinance. So in Pasadena, our inclusionary ordinance was adopted in 2001. It was a split vote, and there was strong opposition, there was threat of litigation, there were doomsday, doomsday for multifamily development was declared, and of course none of that happened. So our inclusionary ordinance currently applies to housing developments of 10 units or more, and so 15% of the units are required to be set aside as affordable. So for rental housing, 10% of the units have to be affordable at low income and 5% at moderate income. For home ownership developments, it's 15% at moderate income. And a developer may provide fewer units but at a deeper affordability. So they could trade 2 moderate income units for 1 very low income unit. And then the units are deed restricted. For the rental housing, the deed restriction is in perpetuity, and for the for sale units, they're for 45 years. The developer is given options to develop the units on site, to pay an in lieu fee, to provide the units on another site, that's our off-site option, or to donate land with a value that's equivalent to what the in lieu fee would have been. And there are incentives that are provided to the developer to build the units on site. So if a developer will build the units on site, they could utilize a density bonus, and the inclusionary units are included within the density bonus requirement. So that's not added, they're not cumulative. Also, they get a reduction, a large reduction in their residential impact fees. So your residential impact fee for a 2-bedroom unit would be $957 rather than over $21,000 per unit. So it's a pretty good incentive there. Building permit fees are partially waived, and traffic impact fees are also discounted. So what have we done? What has the ordinance produced? So far, we've had 530 units that have been completed, and you can see over here about 92% of the units have been rental. So almost all the rental developers will actually build the units, and 8% of the units here are the for sale units. So almost all the condo developers will pay the fee. And then you can see we have a majority of the units have been moderate income, but we have quite a bit of very low income units as well. Currently, we have 7 projects under construction that have another 68 inclusionary units, mostly rental and mostly low or very low income units. An example of one of our developments, this is the Westgate Apartments. This was 498 units total, and 96 of the units are very low income, and these are in a transit-oriented district. It's just south of Old Town. And then here's an example of a project where the developer elected, in this case they elected to pay partial in lieu fee and partially provide some of the units, meet their inclusion requirements off-site. And so they acquired and this bungalow court that had been used as a commercial property. and they restored it back to residential. I wanted to show you where the inclusionary units are. One of the strengths of an inclusionary ordinance is that the affordable units get built where in the prime areas, the areas where market rate development that are attractive for market rate development. So in Pasadena, we have Northwest Pasadena, indicated up here in this area, and that's our lower income section of Pasadena. And we have probably maybe about 60% of our affordable housing is in Northwest Pasadena right now. And you can see where the inclusionary units are. They're all down here. Almost none of them are within this, within Northwest Pasadena. So geographically dispersing affordable housing is one of the best, the benefits of inclusionary ordinances. This shows you where our light rail stations are. So you can see most of those units are built in the transit-oriented areas. So the benefit there is that the low-income households tend to be heavier transit users. Okay, in terms of the in-lieu fee, when a developer elects to go the in-lieu fee route, then half the fee is due at the building permit issuance and the other half due at the issuance of the certificate of occupancy. We've collected almost $22 million to date in inclusionary units. We've been able to leverage some additional money with a state fund. And of course, when these dollars are used in affordable housing, to develop affordable housing projects, we leverage the money again with low-income housing tax credits, county dollars, new market tax credits, et cetera. Okay. So the fee amount is based on the size of the development and the applicable fee rate. And I'll show you in a minute that we have different rates for different parts of the city. And also the in-lieu fee rates are adjusted annually by the CPI. And there are also, the ordinance provides for periodic readjustments of the in-lieu fee. So about every 5+ years, we revisit the in-lieu fee. So these show the different zones with the different in-lieu fee amounts in the city. They're based on similar market conditions. So in the areas where there's a strong market, then the fees are higher. In the area where there's a weaker market, the fees are lower. And so we have a different map for rental, and this map over here is for home ownership. So on the rental side, our fees range from $1.19 per square foot. That's for our lower income section over here, Northwest Pasadena, where there's almost no multifamily market rate developments. So the fee is very low there, so as not to be an impediment for market rate development. Elsewhere, it goes up as high as $33, almost $34 per square foot, and that's per square foot of the entire project, not just of the affordable units. Okay. On the for sale side, it goes from almost $17 to almost $64 per square foot. So the way it'd be calculated, if we have a 40-unit project, 36,000 net residential floor area for the entire project, including all the units, market rate units, et cetera. The fee rate in that zone is $25.21 per square foot, and so the total is over $900,000. All right, and so we take that money goes into an affordable housing fund, and we use that money to build more affordable housing. So this is a project that is under construction right now using inclusionary fees, and it's a 21-unit market rate, first-time home buyer project. And then this is a very low income, extremely low income special needs development, permanent supportive housing for homeless families. And this is a very low income senior housing project. These last two projects, the last two projects were just completed in this last year, and the first project is under construction right now. Okay, and so finally, I would just, since we are the host or the co-host here, if the other speakers, at the end of your presentation, if you can offer one or two suggestions of what you might think might be a good way to improve Pasadena's inclusionary ordinance, we'd greatly appreciate it. Anything that comes to mind, anything that you guys are doing that we're not doing, that's working for you, we'd love to hear that. Okay? Thank you very much.
All right, thanks, Bill, and really appreciate the offer to put the Bill Wong pinata up here. You can just beat up on it as much as you'd like. So next we're going to talk a little bit about the experience in Santa Monica, and James Kemper, the Housing Programs Manager for the City of Santa Monica, is going to present. James he gets the award for brevity in the bio that he sent. He's been doing this for about 25 years, been working in Santa Monica in various roles at that city, and most recently has been looking at the inclusionary program. Please.
Thank you, Alan. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you, Bill, for firing up my PowerPoint. Santa Monica has been doing inclusionary housing for about 30 years. A key milestone was in 1990 when the Santa Monica voters adopted a local initiative that mandated 30% of all the multifamily development, which is any development of 2 units or more, has to be affordable to low and moderate income households. That's about all the initiative said. So as far as the details, it's been implemented through various ordinances over the years. The current version of the city's inclusionary housing policy is known as the Affordable Housing Production Program, which I will refer to as the AHPP for brevity, if you'll excuse me. One thing I did want to tout while I had the opportunity, Santa Monica's pretty proud about this figure, which is that since 1994, 38% of all the multifamily development is affordable to low and moderate income. Although I need to disclose, to be fair, that only a portion of that is from the inclusionary housing program, and a large component of it is from city-funded affordable housing, where the city provides money to loans to nonprofit developers who then build and operate the housing. And the city uses housing trust funds to do that. Primarily, one of the funding sources was redevelopment housing funds, which was eliminated in 2012. As far as an overview, I'm going to try not to get too wonky. As Alan has requested, there are some wonky slides in here. I'll try to speak more generally. A couple of key themes run throughout the city's inclusionary housing policy. One is that the requirements are different for an apartment development versus a condominium development. It's also, the requirements are different depending on the scale or intensity of the development. Santa Monica refers to its by right zoning as Tier 1, and anything above that, there's Tier 2, there's Tier 3, I don't talk about in here, but Tier 2 is basically sets forth the rules under which you can get a higher scale development, but you end up having to do more affordable housing. As we go next. Just wanted to touch on the data for a second, the accomplishments the city, through affordable housing, inclusionary housing, been able to do a little more than 1,000 units over the last few decades. The unit sizes are equally spread among studio, 1 and 2 bedrooms. Haven't seen a lot of 3 bedrooms, but it's primarily because the market doesn't, the Santa Monica market doesn't provide a lot of 3-bedroom units. Looking at the data another way, who's served, there's a range among very low-income households and to moderate-income households. In the last few years, the inclusionary policy has been tweaked to provide an incentive to do extremely low-income units, so that we are seeing units in the pipeline now for extremely low-income households. And when we open our waiting list, our rental housing voucher waiting list and other waiting lists, often the largest portion of folks who applied are extremely low income and smaller households. We monitor each and every unit annually. There's a small fee, compliance monitoring fee charged annually, about $150 that funds a position to focus on this entirely. And we owners can submit annual reports online that are summary reports, but then also are required to submit the income eligibility documentation that they relied on to make sure the folks who live there are eligible, and our staff goes through that. As I mentioned, it's called Tier 1 and Tier 2 developments, and basically what you need to remember is the higher scale of intensity in Tier 2 developments, you need to do more affordable housing, and those developments do not have an option to pay the in lieu fee. The options for apartments are basically pay a fee, build units on site, or build units off site. If you build them off site, you have to do 25% more units than you would if you included them in your market rate building that you do an on site. And you need to build them concurrently with the market rate project. So we're not going to allow the market rate development to open up and while the affordable project is not done yet. For condominium projects, for most of them, for all but a few exceptions, they have to pay a fee. Condominium developments of 2 or 3 units can, what we call fee out, rather than do on-site units at a rate of almost $40 a square foot. And like rental housing, if they want to do them off-site, you have to do 25% more. When you do a condominium developments of 4 to 15 units or 16 or more, there are different percentages. As Bill mentioned in his presentation, basically the deeper you target the affordability, the smaller ratio of affordable units you need to include in your developments. Another component of the HPP is that the affordable unit is assumed, the requirement is assumed to be a 2-bedroom unit unless basically virtually almost the entire project is either a 1-bedroom development, a development of 1 bedrooms or studio apartments. In those cases, then you can do your affordable units. This was put in place so that a market rate project doesn't do all 2 and 3 bedroom units and says, oh, for affordable, we'll do small studios or 1 bedroom. And then there are some minimum unit sizes for the same reason. They don't have to, the affordable units do not have to be the same square footage as the market rate, but they need to be not significantly smaller. And that's the purpose of those minimums. So for Tier 2, you have to do, if I mentioned, 50% more affordable than you have to do in a Tier 1 project. You can do units targeted to extremely low, very low, or low, but not to moderate income households, and you lose the option to fee out. The affordability ratio is there on the screen. I'm trying not to keep walking and reading all these numbers, but there it is. Each of these numbers is 50% more than the numbers you see for the Tier 1 projects. And the other component of the Tier 1 requirements is that you have to have the average bedroom size of all of your affordable unit group, and that has to be the same as the market rate, so there's not a disparity. Another component specifically for Tier 2 projects is the City Council wanted to see a mix of unit sizes in developments, not only in market rate housing, and then therefore in inclusionary housing. So more recently, policies have been tweaked to incorporate the rules you see up there on the screen. There was a recent history of a lot of developments in the downtown where the only thing being built was large-scale 100-unit studio projects, and so the council feels it important to have unit sizes that will accommodate families, smaller families, large families. So those are requirements for Tier 2 projects. And then the downtown area of Santa Monica, which is basically an 8 square block area, has very specific inclusionary housing requirements that were established in the last year that requires that 20 to 30% of the units on a per project basis have to be affordable. And then to counteract the trend that we had seen where developers are generally, if they're doing on-site affordable housing, they're choosing to do whatever the lowest percentage of affordability is, even though it's a deeper target, then the only thing we're getting are all extremely low-income units, which is not a bad thing, but it only meets one portion of the need. And so a recent change in the inclusionary policy, specifically to the downtown area, has this, basically says within the affordability mix of the development, you need to have units targeted to all the different affordability levels. As one of the, I think as Bill mentioned, the inclusionary policies tend to have incentives as well as requirements. Listed them here. There's administrative approval, which means that the rules are in the zoning code. If the proposed development meets the rules, there's no politics to the process. There are no public hearings other than normal design review hearings. You receive density bonuses. In commercial areas, you receive FAR, which stands for floor area ratio, and you receive height bonuses. Usually, you have a whole other floor, sometimes more, and those 100% affordable projects are exempt from development impact fees, which adds up usually to tens of thousands of dollars, sometimes $100,000 or more. Some of the recent trends we've seen, because the on-site requirement for condominium projects starts at 4, we see a trend where there are a lot of 3-unit condominium developments in the pipeline, and that's a fairly common thing, not only for this regulation, but any regulations where development sees where the line is drawn, and sometimes will go on the side that allows them to fee out. Alternatively, we're seeing a lot of 5- and 6-unit condominium developments, which if it was a market rate development, the lot and the zoning would allow 4 units, but because by setting aside one of the units as affordable, then because of state density bonus laws and some local incentives, then the development is allowed to be 5 or 6 units, thereby offsetting the cost of the affordable unit and creating more housing. And then the other trend is we're seeing a high-density project in the downtown area and along the boulevards, such as Lincoln Boulevard, which is the specific intent of recent changes in the city zoning code to achieve its housing goals in the downtown area and along the boulevards where there is transit, and take the development pressure off the neighborhoods, the residential neighborhoods. And lastly, this is what our pipeline currently looks like in terms of inclusionary housing in construction, and with planning approval, 337 units total. And and they are tending now toward the extremely low and very low, where historically the majority of them were moderate and low. And with that, concludes my presentation.
All right, Jim, thank you. So West Hollywood, yeah? Is it? I just can't see it. That's the problem.
Yeah.
Oh, I appreciate that.
You got it.
Yep. All right, well, while you're doing that. So our next speaker is Peter Noonan, who manages and operates the Rent Stabilization and Housing Division at the City of West Hollywood. He's been there since 2013. Excuse me, before that I think he was in Beverly Hills, Santa Clarita, and Seattle. Peter.
Thank you. Again, my name is Pete Noonan. I'm the housing manager for the City of West Hollywood, and I'm going to broaden the discussion of inclusiveness a little bit outside of the provision of units within new market rate buildings. And to provide, and to give some reason for that, I'm going to provide some context from the City of West Hollywood. So probably most people in the room know where we are, but you may not know that we are only about 2 square miles. We have a population of 35,000, and we're right between Beverly Hills and Hollywood in a very dense, high-rent area of the city. we were founded on rent control and on inclusiveness in and of itself. In 1984, we were incorporated. Shortly afterwards, the council adopted a rent stabilization ordinance and then adopted inclusionary zoning. And this is about the only acronym that I have in this presentation, I hope, IZ, inclusionary zoning. In addition, at that same time in '86, with inclusionary zoning, an on-site requirement, a optional fee in lieu for some projects, we also created the West Hollywood Community Housing Corporation, a nonprofit corporation, to partner with to use those funds to draw down additional funding sources to construct 100% affordable buildings. So a little bit about our community. We're 80% renters. And in West Hollywood, we tend to have more seniors than in the region. We tend to live alone. We do represent a large contingent of the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender community. And we have a substantial representation of immigrants from former Soviet socialist republics. Now, on average, not just for us, but just, I believe the census tells us in general that every 5 years, about 50% of the population moves and shifts in the LA area. And I think that that's an important consideration to have, especially when you think about inclusivity and how can you assure that people can have the housing or achieve the housing that they need. Now in West Hollywood, we're, in general, we're 40% lower income, 17% moderate, and then 43% above moderate. I like to look at this in dials, and I apologize if it's a little blurry, but what that means is that essentially there's about 10,000 households in West Hollywood that are above market, and there's 13,000 households that are, have some form of affordability need. So we use those dials to consider what inclusionary housing programs would be best and most important for us. We do go out to our community on a regular basis, and we take a pulse on what programs are of interest, what's the desire, what is the need out there in the community. And we oftentimes, quite hands down here, rent stabilization is an incredibly important aspect of keeping people in the community. And I would say that when we look at that, it is probably our strongest inclusionary program. Of course, on-site affordability and new construction, or what most people would call inclusionary zoning, inclusionary housing, is also an extremely key program in West Hollywood. We do also have the affordable housing in lieu fee that I mentioned, and we have a commercial impact fee based on the impact that new commercial would have on the need for affordable housing. I'm not going to focus on the fees in this presentation, but more so I'm going to give you a little plug on rent stabilization. I'm going to dive right into our inclusionary housing, our on-site affordability. So this is, simply put, 70% of our housing units are rent stabilized. And when you look at that, if you've been living in your unit since prior to an ordinance called Costa-Hawkins, when we were able to control the rents, your average rent for a one-bedroom is about $1,000, and that's affordable rent. Today in 2017, or last year, the rents on average for that one-bedroom, that same one-bedroom unit, went for almost $2,000. Now, interestingly enough, and I don't really understand the mechanisms behind it because we're still in I think an increasing housing market, but between 16 and 17, we saw our rent stabilized housing stock drop. So we actually saw negative rents in our rent stabilized housing stock. Like I said, I don't know the reason for that. We did have some amount of development in the last 4 years, which I'm about to show you, and market trends would suggest that with new development, rents should go down. But just the simple point is that the rents are higher, but I think rent stabilization tends to temper increases and decreases in the market sometimes. So, inclusionary zoning. Our local program requires 2 to 10 unit projects to provide 1 unit of housing. There is an option to pay the fee in lieu. Our 11 plus unit projects, there's a 20% on-site mandatory requirement. Half of the units are for lower income households, meaning either very low or low, and half are for moderate income. This is the generalized rules in the city. We do have other rules. I'm going to stay out of that, those deeper policy levels, or those deeper requirements, but this is essentially, in general, the rules. Now, those of you that know West Hollywood might be saying, hey, wait a minute, why those 2 pictures? These are both affordable housing projects, and these were projects that were built with our in lieu fees. So these are not inclusionary buildings in itself, but these are the product of the fees that have come in. Now, many communities that have programs, affordable housing programs, know that you can achieve other goals within that program. This top unit, the top picture actually preserved a historic building at the front, and then we constructed units behind, for instance. So another aspect of our program is equity, and we require an equal distribution of the units within the building, within the unit sizes, and we require equal finishes and appliances. So you can see this is one of our newest inclusionary buildings. We have 8 units in this building. 4 are very low and 4 are low. And all of the units are exactly the same. They're all one-bedroom units, identical units within. Everybody has these front-loading, high-end washers, etc., in the building, in the units. So the intent here is that we want to provide the experience of being equal in any way, shape, and form to the market rate tenants. So here's a couple of pictures of some other buildings that we've achieved in the city. Now, 2 of these buildings are 100% affordable buildings, and 2 of these are inclusionary buildings. The top one in the left, this is our most recent senior building. This is Movie-Town Seniors. This was built in partnership with Avalon Bay and the West Hollywood Community Housing Corporation. It is one building on a site that has 4 buildings. This is the 20% requirement for a 385-unit project. So there's 77 units of senior housing. We were able to achieve extremely low income to low income rents within that building. The buildings here in the upper right and in the lower left are both inclusionary buildings. These are both market rate buildings that have inclusionary units in them. The upper provided 20% very low income units, and the lower provided 10% with a fee. This was part of a development agreement and a fairly extensive negotiation. The final building here, Sierra Bonita, this is one of our buildings that was built through the affordable housing fees. This is a 42-unit special needs building that's managed by the West Hollywood Housing Corporation and also has their headquarters. So what I love about this slide is really just you could see the value and the beauty that you can achieve through architecture in inclusionary programs, affordable buildings. There's really no discernible difference between affordable buildings or inclusionary buildings and market rate construction. So here's our 2017 accomplishments. We completed and leased up 58 new inclusionary units, and we have 154 units in the pipeline. This is our impact, and unfortunately, the numbers in the market rate units have been cut off this slide. I apologize for that. This is 2,095. But really, the importance here is showing how many units we've achieved in the inclusionary program. And remember, in context, we're 2 square miles. Yet, and we're about to have 500 units. We have done this, in fact, if you see the dates on the bottom, most of this development has been achieved after the dissolution of redevelopment. So in 2013, we had 106 units in the program, and that's our sum total that we'd had since 1986. Today, we have 322, so we've quadrupled the number of units, and we're about to add another 154. That's impact. This is our 2018 Affordable Housing Dashboard, and we can really see that impact when we look at all the other sources of deed-restricted affordable housing or program affordable housing in the city. And again, I want to emphasize the importance of inclusionary since the dissolution of redevelopment. These checked boxes show you how many units we've achieved using the traditional model of partnering with a nonprofit and using our trust fund to leverage other funds. We've achieved so far 22 units in construction, whereas we have this box here. I believe that it's about a little over 350 units of inclusionary. So it's become it's a very important part of our program today, and meeting a definite need in the community. Distribution. I love this map. This map really shows us how we've been able to distribute affordability throughout the city through the inclusionary program. Now, under redevelopment, our redevelopment area was on the east side of the city, and approximately right in here, this portion. But through the inclusionary program, now what this is showing, the transparent boxes are inclusionary projects, and the solid boxes are affordable housing boxes, projects. So with inclusionary, we have been able to achieve and distribute affordability throughout the city from east to west. The dials on the bottom, they may be a little small. Some of you might have been lucky enough to pick up an annual report that I had provided. I didn't have enough for the room, but I did provide some. And that has a chart in it that shows these dials. It really gauges the level of affordability that we've been able to achieve through each program. Now, if you can tell just by dark colors on these three dials, the one on the very left is the proportion of households in our community at need. And if you look at that really black color, that is our very low income need. 60% of affordable households are very low income in West Hollywood. So in our affordable housing program, we really achieve housing for that segment of the community, with almost all affordable projects being targeted at very low or lower incomes. Our inclusionary, however, is able to achieve housing for low income and for moderate. And so we have 23% of our inclusionary units are moderate housing, and you're not going to get those units through the traditional affordable housing projects that you have with nonprofits. There's no other money out there available to leverage for moderate units. So this has actually honestly been a very strong program for meeting that need within West Hollywood. So in sum total, West Hollywood has approximately 24,000 households. This is from the HUD CAS data, the Comprehensive Housing Affordability Strategy data. We have about 13,000 households earning affordable incomes. This is where rent stabilization comes in. It's incredibly important. We have almost 17,000 rent stabilized units. And in our permanently affordable housing, all of our units are permanently affordable, both for sale or rental. We have approximately about 1,500 units when this is all said and done. So really, our greatest affordability is in our rent-stabilized housing stock. So other inclusive activities, I just wanted to throw it in there as a plug, is we have eviction protections, relocation fees, protection for tenant harassment. We do advocacy at the state, and we do provide home secure programs to provide accessibility measures for low-income households. We're studying incentives for landlords to reinvest in their buildings, tenant opportunity to purchase programs, to really grow that ownership within our region and within our city, since we are 80% renter. And exploring other innovative housing types. We also launched an initiative of aging in place, aging in community. This initiative is really targeting to ensure that we are an age-friendly community. And so as people age within West Hollywood, we are ensured that they can remain within the community. So considerations. I didn't really want to target anything specific for Pasadena, but I just wanted to put out there the thoughts that for anybody interested in looking at inclusionary programs, that you should really design your programs not to meet RHNA, but to meet your housing need in the city. RHNA is really a floor. It's not the end, and if you meet your RHNA, you're not done. It's really, there's that gauge of what's the housing needs of your population, of your households in your local communities. That being said, your programs can be tailored to fit your community, and as you've noticed, each one of our cities has done this a little differently. We've designed it differently based on the local needs. Meaningful housing policy needs and requires political commitment. And oftentimes, when I go to my council, I receive a 5-0 vote. And that, I think, that's important. And it's important because I think that housing oftentimes gets contentious, it gets emotional, and you need to have that strong will at the council to guide those decisions going forward. A great tool out there, in addition to the tool that was mentioned on designing inclusionary programs, and I think some folks probably picked this up, Grounded Solutions Network. It's a national organization out there, nonprofit organization of land trusts and inclusionary housing programs. They have a toolkit on inclusive growth, and this could be very helpful. I'd encourage you to have a look at their website, download the toolkit, and have a look through it at some of the different options that are out there. Because again, Inclusiveness is, it comes in many shapes and forms, and in closing, I should say that it is always in partnership with market rate developers, because market rate development is key to inclusionary programs. If you don't have the housing market, you don't have the units on site, and so that's important. And it's whether you have a fee or whether you have on-site units really depends on the strength of your market. And so those are my closing words. Thank you much.
Thanks, Pete. It's a perfect kind of transitional concept. I don't know which presentation is it. Doesn't have one? Okay, great. So we're going to transition from looking at programs in cities and how they work, and listen a little bit to what these programs mean in context, and what do they mean specifically for people who are in the business of real estate development. So we're going to start out with Ben Besley, who's a independent developer who has been doing real estate development, particularly the infill and the mixed-use kind, throughout California. He has done entitlements and permitting in most of Southern California, and has also worked for the city of Ventura, Big Rock Partners, and the Olson Company. Ben.
All right. This isn't a microphone. This is a microphone. Is this not working? Yeah, exactly. As you can see, my technological proficiency is nowhere near our previous speakers, as evidenced by my talking into the light. I don't have a presentation, so you'll have to, pay attention to me. I apologize. But I'd like to just start by introducing myself, I have about 10 minutes to talk. I think if I had about 12 or 13 minutes, I could probably provide an explanation for all of this. But since I only have 10, I'm going to have to stop short. And I'm just going to touch on, I think, 3 or 4 major topics, which I think once we get to the Q&A session and with the guests that are with us this afternoon, we can get into some great conversations. For starters, I'm here today, first of all, gratefully, thank you very much, Bill, for inviting me and putting this whole thing together. This is a fantastic conversation. I work for a private investment and development firm. I recently joined a firm out of New York called Midwood that is looking at Southern California very aggressively for long-term investments in housing, both for sale and rental. Prior to that, I worked for City Ventures, the Olson Company, both of which are infill residential developers and builders, as well as a private investment firm called Big Rock Partners that was doing little apartment, a little bit of everything. But all of these are private sector, and so we're looking at return on investment and risk. Those are the 2 things we play with every day. On top of that, I have the privilege of serving on the Housing Authority for the City of Los Angeles HACLA board. I'm the board chair, and in that organization, we're responsible for really providing guidance to our CEO and staff for the 68,000 affordable units that HACLA provides throughout the City of Los Angeles. So I have a perspective on longer term how some of the things we're talking about today, how they can have effects down the road. And I'll also just start by saying that some of you probably know for-profit developers and even have considered some of them friends. In fact, I think in the public discourse, it's an easy target. But the fact is, I'll speak for myself, and I think I can speak for John Reekston, who's going to follow me. John and I are former colleagues. That you don't get into real estate development, certainly not on the development side, if you don't actually care about the places you're building in. If you actually want to make more money, you get in the finance side. So we come at this really from I believe, a balanced perspective. But that perspective, truly, when looking at this from a private development side, is that the business of development is a parcel by parcel search. We have people that are out looking all over the city of Pasadena and Los Angeles and West Hollywood and Santa Monica and everywhere. And with each parcel, you have to evaluate, first of all, is somebody going to sell it? And second of all, if they are, Is the price they are going to sell it at, you know, something that we can actually underwrite and build? The, you know, and affordable housing being a tremendously important issue, and inclusionary housing probably being one of the most efficient tools to start to generate housing like this. I'll emphasize that it is a tool, and to echo Peter's point, I think, and I'll get to this later, it must be part of a larger conversation. It must be part of the political discourse, so that everybody understands why, when these rules are enacted, you know, why they're so important. But you know, from the private developer's perspective, if we're looking at doing a project in the city of Pasadena, we just have to ask the question, how much is this going to cost? And it's a pretty clear question. And that gets into the underwriting, and that basically tells us whether we can afford to do this project and move forward or not. You know, we see a lot of projects that get built, and you can have opinions on whether they were done well or not done well. What you don't see is probably the 95% of developments that never got built. There's an interesting, you might have heard of a group up in the Bay Area, San Francisco Bay Area Renters Federation. It is run by this very dynamic woman who what she does to create public awareness is she writes ads in Craigslist for like a 2-bedroom apartment in the inner Sunset for $2,300 a month. And if you go to find that home, she will send you the Planning Commission denial of that project. And that is her way of saying, look, it could be here, but they're not getting approved. I'm sorry, I'm getting a little bit off topic here. But the point is that it really just becomes a question of like, are the requirements for the inclusionary zoning clear? I would say that, you know, I've had the experience of working with Bill in Pasadena, and I say this, you know, not needing anything from Bill or the city of Pasadena at this point. Like, they're wonderful. They're extremely clear. The instructions are clear, and the ability for us in a short order to understand this is what we're going to be doing in the development, this is the size, what we're going to have to build, this is how much it's going to cost. Great. If we can do it, we'll do it. I don't think at Olson Company or City Ventures, we never didn't do a project because the inclusionary requirement was too complicated. It made the process more difficult, and I would say it sort of pitted the developer against the city when those rules aren't clear. An example is something we went through in the city of Bellflower. Anybody from Bellflower here? Okay, good. No, they again, with all good intent, they have an inclusionary housing ordinance, but the requirements, the income limits, you know, just the requirements for lending on those things aren't clear. So what it means is that we signed the development agreement. Of course, we're going to do the project. Of course, we're going to be, you know, a great partner to the city. But when it comes down to it, and we have to start, you know, getting to brass tacks, it is, instead of legislating it as Pasadena does in a very clear rule, you're sort of leaving it to staff and the developer, and it's just adversarial. So I would say that's sort of rule number one. We, you know, clear is, the more clear the better. And I wouldn't say that there's any level of income, again, that precludes us from doing the project. It's either it's a yes or a no. It's, you know, and so of course in some level of affordability it makes it impractical. You know, I think that the other thing it does, obviously, and we heard this in the case of the city of Santa Monica, is that it does start to warp the design of what gets built. So you, as you were explaining, you do see a lot of 3-unit projects. You probably see a lot of 15-unit projects. So you start, you know, designing projects to sort of meet a certain or stay under a certain hurdle. All of which, I would argue, means certain things don't get built. And it gets back to that idea that, like, we're talking about stuff that gets built, and a lot of it is wonderful and valuable, but for those of us that really want to see more inclusionary housing get built, it's the stuff that never, you know, got to see the design commission or the planning commission. So my role with the housing authority is interesting because I've been on the board for 4 years and the chair for 3 years, and this is an organization that is taking about $1 billion a year of federal money. We are overseeing in 14 public housing developments about roughly 6,000 units and another 60-some thousand units in vouchers. But these are all deeply, deeply affordable, serving all kinds of populations, from elderly to homeless to special needs. And, you know, I think the striking thing there, which you know, is an interesting case study for, you know, looking at where these programs are today, is that, you know, with that many, I mean, that's a big number. 68,000 units is a lot. The wait list to get into one of those is 11 to 15 years. I mean, that was my first reaction. I was like, that can't be right, but that's true. And so we're talking about a resource that it's such a valuable resource, but there just isn't enough of it to satisfy the need, right? And that's ultimately what we're trying to do is keep our communities economically diverse, and you know, and create opportunities in the housing ladder. So I think what we're challenged with in a housing authority, and something I think is interesting to look at in the inclusionary zoning ordinances, is outcomes of residents. So often these things are measured in units. How many units did you produce? What percentage of your housing stock? At what level of affordability? But if we create, as we have done with the housing authority, you know, a development with 300 units in it, and 30 years later, 90% of those families are still living there, that is, you know, tens of thousands of people that never had the opportunity to get into that housing, get that first step, and start to make some economic headway. So, you know, it is fraught with all kinds of political issues when you start talking about, you know, how to help people move on and how to do that in a way that is, you know, is equitable and is fair. But I think, again, it's part of this political discourse to understand that we can count units, and it's something that is not difficult politically to describe. It gets more difficult to start to describe people and why they got there in the first place and what we can do to help them move on. Because ultimately, I personally believe that it's important that as much effort as we put into creating these homes for people to start to get on the housing ladder, we deliver as much effort into sort of making sure that it's serving a purpose to help, to the degree that certain households can, find their next step on the economic ladder, not only for their sake, but for the sake of all the other folks in these cities that need that home. So, with that said, you know, I think that if I could offer a couple of suggestions, I think that, first of all, that first one being really focusing on resident outcomes and what role is that affordable unit playing in the life of this particular family or, you know, household, or if you, again, difficult to track that on an individual basis, but if you were to do it in aggregate so you can start to understand what effect is this having on our community, that's important. I think that's also important because it makes it easier to participate in the political discourse. So when we're talking about units and we're talking about money, like that is where, you know, we can be on different sides of a discussion. But when we start talking about helping people and helping the people that live around us, I think that's something that politically people can actually come together on. So, you know, it's the city of Pasadena is an extremely well-managed city, and I would say that even the city of Pasadena and the city of West Hollywood and Santa Monica as well, I mean, have enough to deal with. So I'm not saying we need more on the political agenda, but I think that is key to a longer-term success of inclusionary housing having the effect and also having other tools to use, is making it part of the political discourse so that when these issues do come up to city council, you know, there's more of a context to it. I would say that, you know, back to my example of projects that never see the light of day, I thought one interesting observation with Peter's slide up here is if you looked at the city of West Hollywood, there's this fantastic dispersion of developments of all different income levels. And I've looked at that and I thought, you know, the reason that there are so many different developments is because so much property has sold. You probably have more transactions in West Hollywood so that developers have the opportunity to come in, which for a host of reasons, I would say actually inclusionary housing being probably low on the list, more to do with the political process and, you know, zoning laws in whichever city. You just see fewer transactions. So if there's a way, whether it's through zoning or making certain, you know, city property available, the more you can, the zoning would provide incentive for a transaction that lets the private developer, myself or others included, come in, participate, and then get involved in the inclusionary housing program. So I really thought that dispersion was fantastic. Something a little bit more practicable is, if there is a I wouldn't say there's, again, getting back to looking at how Pasadena's program is structured, I couldn't recommend anything that would make it better. That's really a reflection of, again, how the housing department and council and staff have kind of thought of how they're going to, with the help of economic studies, figure out how many units we want to produce, and it's about a projection. But I would say that if there is another tool, it would be using some of that money that is set aside for these projects to actually be used as seed funding for loans or for equity for people who are ready to buy a home. Maybe not in the low or even moderate, but even just a resident who might have a certain responsibility in the city, such as a police officer or teacher, so that you could help somebody maybe at a moderate income, maybe slightly above moderate, get into that housing ladder. It's equity or it's a loan, so it has a time constraint on it. So in 5 years or 10 years or whatever that right number is, hopefully it's helped, hopefully it's provided a basis, but in any case, it turns over, that money goes back, and somebody else in the city has the opportunity to then get into the program. And I think the idea of equity share is great because it means that the city actually gets to participate in appreciation of the value of the home. And I think that's all I've got for now. So I'll look forward to the Q&A session, absolutely. Thank you.
Thanks, Ben. That was terrific, really thoughtful. To talk about the political will, about 3 years ago at our conference that we hold every fall, we had a pollster there. And the pollster got up there and said, housing affordability has cracked the top 3 issues for the electorate for the first time ever. So public safety, jobs, education. Housing affordability had sort of figured out a way to get up in there. And since then, and the pollster said at that moment that he expected that the window on that sort of sunshine of public attention would last about 18 months. And 3 years later, we're going to have an affordable housing bond on the ballot in November, and the prospects for that passing are really good. And so, I don't know how long it is that the electorate will continue to understand that this is an issue and it's something that needs to be done about it. But it's certainly, we're in a moment of rarefied air right now. And the reason why all these things make it to the ballot and localities are looking at programs to incentivize affordable housing is not only because they're terrific leaders and great statespeople, but also because the voters have said, hey man, this is an issue and we really need to do something about it. And so I don't think that we can act expeditiously enough for those of us who are advocates, so let's just keep our eye on the ball. We will come to our next speaker, John Reekston, who's from the Olson Companies. He's been there for about 14 years, and before that he was in local government for another 17 before that, places like Huntington Beach and others. And he oversees the project entitlement activities at the Olson Company. So, John, please.
Good afternoon. I want to start out by thanking Bill and Alan for inviting me here. I'm honored to be on the stage with some very distinguished individuals and folks, a lot of whom I've worked with for many years. And I also want to thank the City Council for hosting this event. Arguably, this issue is the key issue facing this nation, certainly the state of California, because we all know that there's a triangle of basic human needs: food, clothing, and shelter shelter being critically important. And there's just not anywhere near enough affordable housing and shelter in the state of California. And there are a lot of other important issues that we're dealing with right now, but we can't diminish how important this particular one is. I'm going to tell a quick story. Back in 2004, I had been at the city of Santa Ana for about 15 years with a 2-year stint at the city of Huntington Beach, working in redevelopment and housing and community development. And I got a call from the Olson Company, whom we had done a project with in downtown Santa Ana, and they said, hey, we just hired this brilliant guy from Harvard named Ben Besley, and as well as some other very brilliant individuals that are going to be project managers. And since we partnered so closely with cities and counties, They wanted to bring me over just to help kind of navigate that city process and getting things entitled. And so I had the great honor of working with Ben and some other really talented people for several years, and hopefully we could work together again someday. I think that'd be a lot of fun. Ben did an outstanding job framing the development community's key interests and concerns related to inclusionary housing. Bottom line is we know that inclusionary housing ordinances and policies are a great step in providing affordable housing in cities and counties. And they're one part of a multi-layered series of tools that need to be in place to truly address the problem long term. And all of those who have spoken already, I really applaud how much thought you have given to the processes that you're implementing in your various cities and counties. A lot of thought, because there are political ramifications to this. You want to encourage development and not discourage it, but you want to try to meet an important goal of your community, which is to provide affordable housing. And you've all done outstanding jobs. And many cities want to do the same thing, and they are turning to the development community for response and for input. And Ben has made these points already. The first is a level playing field. If you're going to adopt an inclusionary housing ordinance and you're thinking about it, do it. Adopt it and make it uniformly applicable to the entire development community. Don't do it on a case-by-case basis. It's not fair to developers. We're all competing for the same piece of the pie. We're all competing for land to provide housing. So if those rules are all clearly defined up front, we can all compete on a fair basis. The other thing is the provision of options. So whether it's a fee or on-site affordable units or the donation of land or some combination of those. For instance, if you have a 2.4 unit requirement, if you allow 2 to be built on site and 0.4 to be paid via the fee, that's a nice option to have also. And many of you have already included that in your programs. But the more options you give the development community, the more developers can adapt to the specific project and the specific site, all of which are different. Whether you're building homes that are $400,000 or $500,000, you're doing market rate affordable units and you can provide them at moderate levels on site, or if you're building $1 million homes and you can pay an in lieu fee so that the city can then turn that around and work perhaps with another developer to build those units or incorporate them into the appropriate developments. That's the kind of variety and the kind of options that are needed. The key issue here is land. This all comes down to the ability to find land and source land and even approach the city or county with a project. Ben mentioned that the vast majority of potential projects never happen. And that's the key to California's problem right now. It's not so much that there's a lack of available land, but a lack of zoned land that can be developed for housing at an appropriate density at an appropriate cost. And there are competing policies that are working against the ability to provide enough affordable housing. There are wage pressures. There's a desire to pay workers a fair wage and a higher wage, which is a great and noble cause. But that also impacts the ability to build and sell homes on an affordable basis. There's a lot of NIMBYism throughout the state and throughout Southern California. Now, in some areas, there's not so much NIMBYism, but if you're building in Orange County and certain areas of LA County, it's tough to get a neighborhood on board to either approve a project that I'm proposing and the density that I need in order to make that work. That may be very difficult unless it's already been pre-zoned by the city or by the county. And so there are several things that can be done to enable that. One is to look closely at your zoning policies. If you want to encourage affordable housing in your community, there has to be a political will and desire and groundswell to provide the zoning for those parcels within the city that could be redeveloped and developed for affordable housing. If that will is not there, you're not going to be able to provide the amount of housing that we need to overall in Southern California to help meet our long-term goals. So fundamentally, while the provision of inclusionary housing and these ordinances are effective, and you guys have done a great job instituting it, honestly, we all know that that's just one small part of the puzzle and one piece of the puzzle, and that there's a lot that still needs to be done politically to enable affordable housing to be built and developed in California. And there are a lot of cross currents at play. And Bill, I think you did ask, what's one thing that, you might, or any suggestions about the city's inclusionary housing ordinance. I think you've got a great ordinance, but the one thing that, Pasadena could look at, as well as many other cities, is the process of entitlement. It's looking at the fees that are charged to developers, and streamlining those processes. We've built 4 communities in the city of Pasadena. Everyone has been a good experience, but Pasadena is not the easiest community necessarily to entitle through. It's a tough process, and you've got tough standards, which is okay, but it's one part of the process that every developer looks at, especially if they're trying to provide affordable housing and minimize and reduce costs and compete for land. And it's not going to be done via inclusionary housing ordinances or subsidy or housing bonds at the state level. Those are all very helpful, and the more that is in play, more units will be created over time. We saw that when redevelopment was still in play. A lot of us played a major role in that over the last 20 or 30 years, and it was very disappointing that went away. And I think you will see a political will to bring back those resources, not so much at the moderate level, but at the low and very low level. But even with that, and even if that funding comes back over time, it's still not going to be anywhere near enough to provide the amount of housing that's needed in Southern California. I've got 2 children, one of whom's already moved to Texas, and the other one's seriously considering doing it. It's very disappointing to me as someone who's been in the field for 30 years, either on your side of the table or doing what I do now, to see 2 of my kids, one already move out of state and another one want to move out of state. And that's you probably feel the same way about your families. You want your families to be able to stay in California, but it's tough for young people, especially coming out of college or whatever they're doing, to be able to afford to live in Southern California and to find a home, or even to find a townhome to live in. And it's going to take a much greater effort. And again, the steps that are being taken by the folks and the cities in this room are an important step. You're doing the right things. Again, it comes down to competing for land. So as long as housing development can trump what an industrial buyer or a commercial buyer or a retail buyer can pay for that property, and where housing development can still generate enough of a land value to buy that piece of dirt and make sure that piece of dirt turns over, as Ben alluded to, property's got to sell for new development to occur. And the only way the property's going to sell is if there's enough of a value to entice that owner of that piece of property to sell it. One way to get over that is to put the zoning in place on enough property at an appropriate density so that land seller can adjust to the new reality that the city council or the board of supervisors puts in place, so that developers like Ben and I and others can compete and approach you and work through your process to get those projects entitled and to get more affordable homes built. So we know this is a bigger issue, but I do applaud everybody in this room and all of your efforts and all of the thought that goes into it, because you all realize how difficult this is to accomplish and how politically difficult it is to accomplish, given the pushback that you get in many instances from your constituents. So with that, I will wrap up. Thank you very much, and look forward to taking your questions. Thank you.
All right, so right before we get to the Q&A, we're going to have Kathy Head bring it on home. Kathy is the managing principal of the LA office of Kaiser Marston. She oversees and manages the firm's affordable housing practice, and also provides public and private clients with real estate economic analysis. Do you have a presentation? Is one of these yours? Is this the one over here on the right? This one?
There you go.
That one?
That's good, better you than me.
Yeah, we'll see.
It's way over here. Yay, yippee. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm super loud, so I'm not sure I'll need the microphone, so maybe I'll use the lamp like Ben did. Anyway, I'm going to start off with a bunch of thank yous. I want to thank Bill and Ellen for putting this together and inviting me. I think that's fantastic, and I'm really happy to speak to you today. I want to thank Tim and his office for putting AB 1505, and getting it all the way to the finish line. Yay, I think we all give Tim a round of applause. It's certainly making my life a lot easier, and I appreciate that. Finally, somebody's going to have to tell me which button. This one? This way? No? Oh, okay, let's see. Like, there we go, okay. Oh, so I'm batting cleanup, which in many ways is a good thing, and it's particularly good today because I don't disagree with anything anybody said. It's really, really pesky when you have to get up and go, nah, mm-mm. So I want to thank everybody for agreeing with me. That's going to make things a lot easier for us all. The other thing that I think is important is in the 3 cities you've had today, talking to you, they all have programs, they all have successful programs, and they're all a little bit different and a little bit the same. And I think that's a crucial point for establishing any kind of inclusionary housing program, is to look at your particular community. Don't try and do a one-size-fits-all ordinance because your needs are different. All 3 of these communities have different demographics, different economics, and they spend a lot of time setting up their programs to meet the needs of their specific population. And you're going to have a much better chance of success if you do that. Second, and I'm echoing what several people said, you absolutely need full-on political support. It's because there's going to be, this has all been really rosy today, and I really appreciate how excited everybody is about inclusionary, but I've been doing inclusionary for about 30 years now, and I get yelled at everywhere I go. I've been booed, I've been hissed, I've been called names, and then people clap. But I think it's really important to understand that political support is the first and most important thing that you can do. I did an inclusionary program for a coastal city in Orange County that will remain nameless that had a 3-2 council. And I said, don't do this. I said it's going to be a mistake because the people who come out who don't like it are really loud, and they don't like it, and they'll tell you why. And so if you're wavering from a political perspective, you're not ever going to get this done, and you're certainly, even if you do get it done, you're not going to get it done successfully. That council changed from a 3-2 to a 2-3 after everything had been done. All the legal work, all the economic, everything had been done. It went down 5-0. So be very, your first step is to make sure that your city council or your county board of supervisors is on board and really wants to see this happen. So yes, I am the doom and gloom speaker because everybody was so positive. Okay, so I get asked these questions all the time when I'm setting up inclusionary housing programs. And so what I wanted to do is I wanted to go over each of them and give you the answers so that when these questions get asked, you'll be prepared. So the first question that comes up is, what impact will inclusionary housing programs have on alleviating your affordable housing shortfall? The second question is, and this one comes up all the time, so I have charts. Do inclusionary housing programs cause a reduction in the amount of production that will occur in the community? That is a very common question. So say, no, development will all stop. And a lot of these things I say have been said by the other speakers, and so I'm echoing their perspective and saying, yes, that's exactly been my experience. The other one is, okay, well, if you impose inclusionary housing requirements, won't that make the sales prices for the market rate units or the rents for the market rate units go up? And the fourth question is, do inclusionary housing obligations create a financial burden for developers? I think it's really important to consider all 4 of these points when setting up an inclusionary housing program, because you don't want any of those things to be true. So you want to create a scenario where you have recognized these issues and you've come up with ways to deal with them. Okay, so the first question, for those of you who are remembering, was the impact of inclusionary housing programs on affordable housing. It is really important to start off with the perspective that an inclusionary housing program will not solve your unmet affordable housing need. It is one tool, it is one arrow in your quiver. It is one methodology to help you to solve your unmet affordable housing need. It is not the final solution. I do think that even though it does only fill a small part of a community's demand for unmet need for housing, it was really interesting to me when I was looking up for this speech and for another speech that I did, is that there are studies that have actually shown that inclusionary housing programs have produced more units in some locations than low-income housing tax credits, which is really phenomenal because the low-income housing tax credit program is the 500-pound gorilla in affordable housing. So I think it's a well-set-up inclusionary housing program can be a very effective tool in your community. The other reason that that's important is as your federal and state funding resources continue to diminish over time, it becomes a more important tool because in Southern California, we've had the benefit in LA County, the city of LA, and the state of California in general, that the public has stepped up and voted for affordable housing money, which has been phenomenal. But the other programs like, you know, redevelopment, rest in peace, and HUD, which is sleeping currently, those funding sources are just decreasing, you know, monthly. Okay, so I conveniently put together a chart for Pasadena, Santa Monica, and West Hollywood. Can anyone tell me why? Of what's happened before and after inclusionary housing has been adopted by the three cities. Because I think this gives a really good answer to, does inclusionary housing as a program, does it cause development to stop in your community, residential development? So my first example, they're in alphabetical order, but we are also in Pasadena. So this is the chart of building permits, residential building permits, 10 years before the adoption of their ordinance and 10 years after the adoption of your ordinance. Does anyone see a pattern? Did development stop? Did development go up and down before, and did it go up and down afterwards? I think you'll see in all three examples, there is no pattern where development stopped as a result of inclusionary housing. So let's move on. This is Santa Monica, 10 years before, 10 years after. I don't see it stopping. In fact, Santa Monica has a unique pleasure of their development actually went up after inclusionary. I'm not arguing that inclusionary caused it to go up. I'm arguing that inclusionary is a very small impact. And again, well-designed inclusionary is a very small impact on production, and that it's other extraneous factors. West Hollywood, unfortunately, didn't have planning data available for 10 years back, so I could only go a couple years back and then 10 years forward. But it follows the same pattern. I mean, clearly what's happening in these three examples is housing production is largely influenced by changes in the marketplace, changes in the economic conditions. I mean, if you look more carefully at these charts and what years they are, you'll see that the recessions, you know, the recession in the late 80s, early 90s, the recession of 2008 to 2011, all of those things are really the major indicators of what's happening to housing production. Okay, so I think what we can say, and have said, is that inclusionary housing does not stop the development of market rate housing. Again, well-designed inclusionary, and that is really important, and that's where I'm headed now. Well, actually, I'm going to do this first, then I'll be headed there. So the other question that I mentioned was market rate sales prices and market rate rents. Do they go down, or excuse me, do they go up as a result of inclusionary housing? So the theory being developers will make up for the affordable housing prices by raising their market rate prices. On a microeconomic level, that's impossible. Because on a micro level, what happens is the developer doesn't say, well, I could charge $310,000, but I only need $300,000. So I'm just going to charge $300,000. There is, on a microeconomic level, there is no reason that somebody could charge more for a market rate unit than what the market will bear. So that's the simple answer. It's the snide answer. It doesn't usually go very far. Supply and demand factors, macroeconomics of big picture supply, big picture demand, says if you're diminishing the supply of housing, back to the production argument, if you're diminishing the supply, then demand is outpacing supply, so prices will go up. That's a legitimate argument. That's a legitimate argument if in fact that's the case. And in some places that is the case. And so if you've established parameters that impede production of housing, then less gets built, prices typically go up depending on other market factors. So then what you have to look at though is, for us, in general, I believe we're largely from Southern California, is the demand for housing, both market rate and affordable, is so far outpacing the supply for a variety of reasons that have been mentioned on both sides of the developer side and the city side for how much development, A, can you get done through an entitlement process, how much land can you find, what's the densities that can be achieved, and those factors all play into how much development can occur. But as we sit today in Southern California, the demand for housing is so much greater than the supply that it is my opinion that the implementation of a well-designed inclusionary housing program will not cause market rate prices and rents to go up. Okay, so the next part of my presentation is talking about ways to have a well-designed inclusionary housing program. And I go back to what I said at the beginning of, don't try to do a one-size-fits-all program, because I do think you're destined to fail if you do that. So take into consideration your market, and I say take your development community into consideration when you're doing the upfront implementation work. I worked with Pasadena when they adopted their ordinance in 2001, and we met with the housing advocacy community and the developer community. I ran numbers for developers, I ran numbers for housing advocacy groups. The city, and this was all through the city was so inclusive in bringing everybody together that when we finally passed it, everybody was really unhappy. So, so I figured my work was done. Everybody got something, everybody lost something. And you know what? It's really worked out. And I told the advocacy groups if they didn't finally say they liked something, they didn't give the council anything to vote for. And that maybe drums weren't appropriate at a city council meeting. Believe me, it was a long process. But ultimately it was put together, and it's a really good program. Okay, so the things you want to look at, the foundational things you want to look at when you're establishing an inclusionary program is you don't want the program to place an onerous financial burden on the developers of market rate housing. One, because the courts have said you can't do that. So don't do that. But two, because you want your program to be successful. You don't want your program to diminish the amount of production that you're seeing. So it's really important to keep that in mind. The other thing to look at is, what are the characteristics of your community? I'll use Pasadena again as an example because Bill showed you the map. Pasadena is really diverse in terms of its economics and its demographics by areas of the city. It also has different density allowances in different parts of the city, which create the opportunity for different types of development. And so when Pasadena put their program together in 2001, that's why you ended up with the two different maps of sub-areas, because the ownership market focused one way and the rental market focused another way because of density largely. And so what they did was they created sub-areas that matched those economic and demographic characteristics. And Pasadena is absolutely a place that needed sub-areas. As Pete mentioned, West Hollywood is 2 miles. It's 2 square miles. You can't actually effectively create sub-areas, even though East-West Hollywood is a lot different than West-West Hollywood. But it's just too small an area to do that. So I say, though, it's very important to look up front to see, do you need sub-areas? For example, the city of LA clearly needs sub-areas because it's gigantic, for one reason, and because it's different all throughout the city. Okay, so then what you need to do is you set your goals. You set your goals for how you want to, what percentages you want to set aside of, so do you want to do a 15% requirement? AB 1505 gives us the useful parameter of saying if you do 15%, HCD can't come evaluate it. So I recommend that. But, so you also want to do separate evaluations for ownership housing and rental housing because, again, they're different. As a general rule, in an ownership program, you're going to want to focus at the higher end of the affordability spectrum because you want people to be able to own their house successfully. You want them to have the discretionary income to be able to stay in their house once they own it. And on the other side, on the rental side, it focuses itself better on the very low and the low. So I think it's important to look at that. The other thing to look at is, where do you want to set your size triggers? So, and each of the 3 communities has different size triggers. So you want to look at that in your community. And then what you need to do, once you establish those goals, is then you need to evaluate it from a financial perspective. So as a general rule, what I recommend is, okay, everybody get together, city council, everybody get together and decide what you want to see as your inclusionary housing parameters, and then evaluate them and see how they work. And if they work, then great. And if they don't, then change them up. So some options that also minimize then the impact that on the developer of an inclusionary housing program. And these are just some. I mean, there's a myriad of things that can be done. But so for on-site production of inclusionary housing units, as a general rule, you might want to look at allowing the market rate units to be larger than the inclusionary units, but making them match up on bedrooms. So say, okay, you can have a 2-bedroom unit and a 2-bedroom unit, or 3-bedroom unit, 3-bedroom unit, but the market rate 3-bedroom unit can be bigger than the market rate 2-bedroom unit. Or you can allow, you can allow the market rate units to have, you know, more, I don't know, luxurious interior improvements. And there are a variety of other relief you can give to the people who produce on site. And because there's a real benefit to on-site production in that, much like Pete's chart, you can see then everything disperses throughout the community, and so you're creating economic diversity. That's the nice thing about on-site production. Off-site production often is allowed, and I think you can also make that very desirable. One, you want to, as a general rule, you want to require the off-site development to be near the market rate. Santa Monica uses 1/4 mile. I've worked with 1/2 mile. It depends on your community, again, of how far the distance is for off-site production. Again, another thing you can do is require more units or deeper affordability than is required for on-site production. Again, I always like to use bedroom compatibility or comparability, just because otherwise you don't want to see all your affordable units being 1-bedroom units and in the middle of a 3-bedroom unit project. So I think, again, I'm not as concerned about the square footage as I am about just the number of bedrooms. But again, these are all policy decisions that you just need to think about up front. In lieu fees are a topic unto themselves, and I think that almost every, or maybe every, inclusionary program I've worked on, and there are 25 of them, has included an in lieu fee option. And what you want to look at when you're establishing the in lieu fee option is you want to look at your program goals. And what's important about program goals is, as I mentioned before, if you do on-site production, you can then disperse the affordability throughout the community. Alternatively, if you collect in lieu fees, you can use those in lieu fees, couple them with low-income housing tax credits or other leveraging sources, and produce units at a lower income level. So you can get deeper affordability for the same price, and so you get more units at deeper affordability. There's no right answer to that question. That varies from community to community. But that's why I say look at your program goals. Look at ownership versus rental. I'm a fan of in lieu fees for ownership units. I just think rental, and again, this is my personal opinion, I just think rental lends itself better to long-term affordability. And so I kind of like to encourage the use of ownership in lieu fees, and I like to discourage the use of rental in lieu fees. But again, no right or wrong answer. That's just something, a policy decision for you to make. Much like with the production, you want to look at the project size thresholds. So, you know, do you want to let projects with fewer than 10 units pay a fee? Do you want to let projects with 20 or fewer? Varies from community to community. Or do you not want to let it be paid by right generally? And that it just requires some sort of buy-off by the city council. Okay. The other thing you want to look at is the community's view on density. Because what a natural byproduct of an inclusionary housing program is a greater use of the state density bonus when it's applicable. So a single family home project, not so much. But for an apartment project or a condominium project, if you as a developer are already getting an affordable housing requirement via inclusionary, then you're more likely to invoke the state density bonus. So the community's views on density are really important because state density bonus, while an excellent tool and used very effectively, is often really unpopular, and you can't stop it. So if a developer comes to you and asks for the state density bonus, you have to give it to them. So if you've established inclusionary housing rules, recognize that as a natural byproduct, you may see more density bonus applications. Okay? The other thing then in lieu fee payments amount is figuring out how you're going to calculate your in lieu payments. If you use an affordability gap methodology, which is to say, all right, if you'd built this on site, it's going to cost you $200,000. and so I'm gonna charge you $200,000 as your in lieu fee. You may, well, you'll still get developers who take it, because if they're equal, they like the upside potential of being able to pay the fee and then use all their units as market rate, unless they want to use density bonus. Two, what happens with affordability gap, though, using that methodology is, it generates enough revenue for then the jurisdiction to go out and find a developer who can leverage, et cetera, and build you at least the same number of units and probably a deeper affordability. So using an affordability gap measure, you know, will generate the higher level of fees. And, you know, some people pay it, some people won't. If you discount the fees, be it for rental or ownership, then what you're doing is you're encouraging developers to use the fee. Okay? So that's fine. It's just another policy. These are all policy decisions. I have to really highlight, they're not right and wrong answers. Okay, so the other options, land dedication comes up all the time, and land dedication was also something that's included in the state density bonus. The one thing I say to be careful with land dedication is, make sure that property is zoned and general planned for residential development so you can actually use it, and figure out whether you can actually get the requisite number of units on that site without providing any additional assistance. And if it does, then ask the developer for that money too. And then acquisition rehab comes up a lot in inclusionary housing programs, and the things to look at for them is you really want to focus it then on buildings that are in really bad shape. You don't want people using projects that are already in good shape and that are fully rented out, and that you're just displacing tenants to put new tenants in, or you're not adding to the supply of affordable housing. So what I like to say is, you know, make them almost uninhabitable. You know, and I've actually used that in some of my inclusionary housing programs, is say, yeah, okay, if folks, you know, they've got to be vacated, because again, you don't want to just be, you know, coming one for one, not creating any new housing. And two, you want to create something new for the community, something better for the community. And so then you allow it to go forward if then they've taken a severely code deficit project and made it habitable and decent, safe, and sanitary. And then make sure the affordable rents are less than the market rents, you know, because otherwise you really haven't achieved anything. Okay, this is my final slide. The things you want to do up front when you're implementing an inclusionary housing program is you want to have a phase-in program, because developers have bought land and then suddenly this whole new restriction is placed on them, and that creates a real impediment. You want to talk about financial impacts. That creates a real financial impact. And so phase it in so that the market has a chance to get used to it. And everybody who's spoken today has said this, and I think it's fantastic. You really need a clear set of administrative procedures. You need to have regulations in place so that the development community knows what they have to do when they come in. So clear administrative procedures are very important. Also, you need to update your program at regular intervals to reflect changes in economics and changes in market prices, market rents, et cetera, so that you're keeping pace. So, for example, I did Claremont's inclusionary ordinance in 2007, 2008. 2011, we completely changed it up as a reflection of the recession and how it impacted the ability of that program to go forward. So you really want to make sure you keep your eye on what's changing in the market. Same thing with the in lieu fee. With the in lieu fee, I think you need to make sure to at least adjust it every year, up or down, with changes in market prices, but just so that you're keeping pace. And then, so that was my final slide. So Bill, my potential changes. I want to start with your really good components. I just have 4 things total. One is your sub-areas are fantastic. I think the sub-areas really work great. I also think that in Pasadena you can pay the in lieu fee by right. I was concerned by that when it was first adopted, but what's happened is it has really worked out that in the downtown where the density is available and the density is actually encouraged, you're seeing folks build their units on site. And in the outlying areas where you're having sort of lower intensity projects with luxury units, you're seeing the in lieu fee paid, but the in lieu fee payment is tracking with the affordability gap. So that's providing a revenue source that allows for the creation of other units. So I think those things both worked out great. And so Bill told me before I started this that I had the least wonky presentation. These last 2 things are incredibly wonky, so you can all just close your eyes for a minute. I I think you should, use sales prices and rents that mirror either state or federal standards instead of the ones you made up. And I think that, only because you got these density bonus projects and you gotta figure out all these different factors involved in that. And, I would change the annual in lieu fee based on a value change rather than CPI. Thank you. And I want everybody to know I came down this story because no one else did.
All right, so I think, we've got a half hour or so for, Q&A, so you guys have opportunity to ask all those burning questions that you've been sitting on for a couple of hours. I think, the concept was we would sort of sit on the stage there. And you know what, I'm gonna let Bill run this, I'm gonna get out of the, okay. Anybody got any questions? Right here, sorry.
My question is for Jim. You mentioned administrative approval process for affordable housing projects. Is that for by right projects? And because it's 100% by right, you're not going to go through the approval process? How does that work? I just want you to elaborate on what's that one.
Well, two things. For, I have some, our planners here, maybe they can correct me if I'm wrong, but one thing for 100% affordable project, is virtually administrative approval. There's not, so it's staff approved. It needs to go to the guidelines and it's staff approved. I want to point out also for some market rate development, up to a certain level, there are administrative approval. It's not just affordable housing. In other words, it's a tool to get to incentivize housing to be developed. If there's uncertainty as to whether or not a developer can even build a project, that's what is considered. That's your question or not?
Maybe you can sidebar after.
Yeah, I'll do that.
Oh, okay. My question is for Tim. I'm just wondering the extent to which you think that AB 1505 is vulnerable to challenge, given the potentially conflicting requirements of AB 1505 and the Costa-Hawkins Act in terms of establishing initial rents?
Yeah, so we're actually looking at possibly new legislation this year to address that concern. It's been brought to our attention by the governor's office. 1506, I don't know if you heard, is the Costa-Hawkins bill that didn't make it out of the housing committee. That's the bill that we carry. But we're looking at reshaping that and seeing if we could address that. It's not exactly 100% of what you're bringing up, but it's touching on the issue, so we're exploring it, because that has been brought to our attention. However, with the requirements of it being, it's California Supreme Court decided that way, so, you know, it can't go much, I mean, unless the process starts all over again at a court being challenged, you know, I guess we'll address it again if it happens, but I mean, that was the California Supreme Court that decided that case, and that was what this legislation is based on, and then we worked with the governor's office to make sure that legislation was, that wouldn't be challenged again, so we're hoping that it holds up. And also, that's why the HCD was brought in as well, to make sure that we're not impeding on housing being built. So some communities might not be meeting their RHNA goals or doing their part of housing, and that's why we brought in HCD to make it so that if you're not meeting your RHNA goals, then we will come to you and make sure that you're making that part of housing in your community. It's to make sure that all communities are doing their part, not just West Hollywood, Santa Monica, but all cities in the district, all cities throughout the state.
I've got a couple questions. First, what the capacity is of the state to hold accountable cities that are not meeting their RHNA goals and making sure they do that. That's one question. One also has to do with how to design affordable, or how to design inclusionaries in such a way that they're not as vulnerable to lawsuits. And then this is kind of a radical idea, but I know in Northern California they're requiring that a percentage of all new, kind of like an inclusionary for homeless. And so in all the developments in certain jurisdictions, they're having homeless people in those apartment buildings. So if there's been any discussion about that. And then my last question relates to
making sure all cities are making their rain goals. So we're actually probably going to introduce legislation probably next week to bring up that part. So, for instance, I'll just sort of point them out. Beverly Hills is not meeting some of their rain goals in certain areas of their levels. That's in our district, so they won't be having their legislation, but West Hollywood and Santa Monica are picking up a lot of that slack. So we're going to be touching on that as well. We're not sure what Dutch Council is going to come up with on that language, but we're going to be making sure all communities are meeting their rain goals, and if they're not, HCD will come in and that will have some enforcement. On the teen part, on the enforcement part, we won't go that far. Senator Scott Wiener up in Northern California is possibly looking at legislation on impacting that, and I believe he's looking at taking away cap and trade funds if you're not meeting reading goals, which are your transportation funds that the state provides. So that possibly might happen. I don't know if it's going to or not. And then what was the second?
Well, I think that the issue's the capacity at HCD to even hold cities accountable. Is there going to be?
Well, there's no legislation really. They don't have any. There's nothing in their books right now or ordinance that gives them that power. So that's why legislation is being crafted on doing that. And again, I think Senator Scott Wiener is looking into that. He's the one that's already just introduced that transit TOD DITS transit around that AB 27. So he's touching on that. But as far as the RENA goals at regional levels, that's what we're looking into. To make sure everyone's meeting the regional levels. And then the teen part will come in, I think, at a different level. That's what it's looking like right now. Again, this is all being crafted. Over the next coming weeks, you'll be seeing a lot more. I'm sure everyone paid attention. There was 168 housing bills last year in the California state around housing only. You're going to see that number increase or be very similar this year. And we're going to be doing a lot more around RENA, CEQA, so stuff that people have really been looking forward to. But it's going to be a fight because we all need all of you to come out and talk to your, give that political cover that people everyone's been mentioning. Because it's going to be really challenging for city council members and elected officials to really carry that policy forward.
Yeah, this doesn't address specifically the HCD capacity, but part of those 167 bills, a 15-bill package, included SB 35, which is essentially a entitlement streamlining program for jurisdictions that are out of compliance with RENA, specifically with whatever tranche of RENA they're out of compliance with. And as a shameless plug, on the 22nd of February, we're doing an event, City of LA, with the City of LA Planning Department, the state, entitlement land use attorney, and some other folks talking about implications of that legislation on development in the city of Los Angeles.
I'm just going to briefly, I think this is on, is it? Yeah.
It is now.
Just briefly touch on the homeless part that you brought up, the homeless housing. So cities and counties are exploring different options to build affordable housing for homelessness individuals. LA County has a current pilot program that gives about $75,000 incentive for people to build ADUs on their lot to house homeless people. So we're actually going to be paying attention to that pilot program and see if that works. If it does, then we might introduce legislation at the state level to also help with that. And I know cities are also doing their own part. Peter.
Oh, thanks. I think that you're alluding to our council is maybe asking me to establish an affordability ADU program. But I didn't really want to talk about that because it's not an establishment. We haven't established it yet. But the idea of housing homelessness in inclusionary buildings, I think or units, is interesting. I have some reservations to it, and the core would be that ultimately it's not the housing, it's the level of provision of services that you would need for homelessness, and it's the wraparound care and focus on the overall well-being of the person. I love the idea of bringing someone into community. In fact, Seattle has a program that's specifically very much like what the county's establishing, where any homeowner can place a 120 square foot box in their backyard, and that provides housing for a homeless person. It comes with wraparound services, and that's key, so that the homeowner doesn't become the de facto counselor. But beyond that, the beauty of this is that you're taking one person out of homelessness and you're putting them into a community of housed individuals, and you're breaking the cycle of homelessness, perhaps, in and of itself. And I think that that's a stronger model, perhaps, than the villages, if you will, just because you get that person out of that existing environment that they're living in at that point. Is inclusionary housing appropriate for that? you don't have that unless you can have that one-on-one wraparound, you know, the real intense wraparound services, and you have, I think the key, the worry that I would have is that you have so many homeowners that they just want to live in their housing and they're not, you know, they didn't sign up to be counselors, that you may run a risk of putting that housing, that homeless person into vulnerability, into a place where they become incredibly vulnerable. And we know that, you know, not everybody really, sometimes people say wrong things and they don't mean it, or it's out of context and they don't understand what they're saying. But when you put someone that's vulnerable into a situation where they can have that on a regular basis, it would tend to demean their dignity in housing. And so in those cases, I would say that it'd just be very careful. And I don't know about the programs in Northern California and how they're doing that, but I as you can tell, I'm very apprehensive. That's all.
I just wanted to follow up a little bit on the enforcement of RENA goals. And we have to be careful about unfunded mandates. I mean, it's one thing for the state to say, you know, certain cities need to meet certain goals, but they don't provide the resources in order to make that happen, to produce the affordable housing, especially with the dissolution of redevelopment, which was our largest permanent funding source. With that gone, and then we get additional goals to provide more affordable housing, the local jurisdictions say, you know, with what? How is this done?
But you were gonna, can you talk about how IZ ordinances can be designed so they're less vulnerable to housing?
Well, I think we, you know, we look to legislators like Assemblymember Bloom to you know, to enact you know, introduce bills and get bills approved that protect it. I mean, I think that's the main thing. And so we have been we've been, you know, waiting for AB 1505 to get approved, and now that it has, now we feel that we have more leeway to look at our inclusionary ordinance and potentially make some additional improvements to it.
This question's for either maybe Bill or Kathy, but this idea of sub-areas is really interesting for cities that have these sub-markets or sub-areas. I'm curious that if the money in lieu fees that you collect within a given sub-area, is it required to be redistributed for projects in that sub-area, or is it a citywide application?
Yeah, for Pasadena, we do have a prohibition for inclusionary units. Like, for instance, if a project is outside of our low-income area and they have an inclusionary requirement and they want to build those units off-site, they can build them off-site anywhere in the city. We don't have the quarter-mile requirement. Our requirement's not that, but they can build anywhere in the city except in the low-income area. So you can't, you know, dump your affordable housing in the low-income area. So that's what we do.
No, I think that's a really excellent question. I mean, you really want to make sure you're not creating islands of affordable housing. And so a lot of communities I work in that have sub-areas require the in lieu fees to be paid in that same sub-area. And as Bill said, there was a real issue here in Pasadena of that part of the community feeling like they were getting all the affordable housing dumped on them because it was the least expensive land in the city. And so that, I think you need to look at those characteristics in your city and plan accordingly so that you don't do that.
Terrific. Did you have one on the aisle here? I was up here. I thought there was a hand down here, so yeah, but please.
Yeah. So this question is for the developers, and I want to make sure I phrase this correctly. So obviously, developers want to make money. You have to be profitable. But assuming that you want to help and do the right thing and, you know, provide these affordable units to help offset the conditions that we're in with the lack of affordable housing in Southern California, what role really does the city play, or how much of a role does the city play in a hindrance in terms of the entitlement process? And it's actually two questions. And the other question for you, John, since you come from a city background, can you offer any suggestions on what can be done in that entitlement process?
Well, in terms of the entitlement process, to the extent it can be streamlined, as least painful as possible to get through your applications, get through your CEQA document and production of that, get to hearing, cooperation between the staff and the developer to move that through to hearing is really what I'm talking about. It's also about fees. You know, are you charging exorbitant fees? There's a lot of elements that go into the entitlement process. The key with the affordable housing portion of this is uniform applicability of whatever standards or ordinance are put in place. So once I or Ben buys a piece of land, that land value has been established now. Let's say it's $5 million. If the affordable requirement comes after that, that's a real punch in the gut, because this is all about solving for a land value and a certain profit margin that has to be made in order to finance your project. I mean, it's that simple. Unless it's a nonprofit development, if we're talking market housing, private developer, it's about backing into a land value and making a certain margin. Now, if you've bought that land already, and then the requirement sets in that, oh, by the way, you've got to provide 5 affordable units, and that's going to cost $1 million. Well, that should have come off the land value. I should have been paying $4 million when I bought the property. So, you know, again, this, you know, Kathy talked about this. A developer is going to raise prices. No, the market is going to dictate how much a developer is going to charge for a house. That's not what's going to happen. What's going to happen is the land market's going to reset for those residentially zoned properties in your city. And once that reset occurs, and all those landowners have internalized that, okay, this affects the value of my land, then they're either going to sell, hold, or maybe look to rezone their property to something else that's more lucrative, potentially. I don't want to say the sky is falling. That's not necessarily the case. But it's just about uniformity, setting the standard up front so everybody can compete fairly, and certainly not hit someone after the fact. That's where the unfairness really comes in.
We're going to do this one, and then I'll come back over to you. Okay.
I agree with everything John just said. No, I think that to take the very first part of the process, I'd say there's 2 phases, at least the way that, you know, I'd say the infill developers who are going to produce some of this affordable housing approach it. You have a period of time where you are competing with other potential buyers, and you make a ton of assumptions. And if you can consider that if we were to look at a piece of property in Pasadena or West Hollywood or Santa Monica today, the homes don't actually get sold or occupied for probably 4 to 5 years. We don't know what the market's going to look like. We don't know what, you know, interest rates, there's all these things. And so to take one piece of it, the affordable housing, which is going to reduce the kind of economic return, and at least, it's echoing what we've already said, at least to just put as many parameters around it and say, we think you're going to charge about this much for the property, and our process is this, and our loan terms are that, as much certainty as possible. I think that the examples that we have, we're talking about today, as Kathy alluded to, are all well-designed programs, and so the level of affordability required isn't necessarily changing that calculus, but I think that's where it comes in. Yeah.
Right here.
I had a post-production question for the agencies that have it. How are you handling the marketing and tenant selection process? Is that something the agency is taking on, or are you passing on that to the developer and then doing this monitoring of them in that process?
We have a requirement that we have to approve the developer's marketing plan, so it does get passed to them. And I put in a little plug to Larry Newnham. Did Larry go already? Yes. Okay, with the LA CDC, they have lahousing.gov, housing.lacounty.gov, right? Something like that, which is the housing search website. And so Pasadena has piggybacked on top of that, and so we have PasadenaHousingSearch.com, and people can search that website. All the units, the inclusionary units, have to be marketed on that site, both rental and home ownership. And so everybody gets a chance to see that's a free housing search website. And then they have a whole marketing plan that we have to approve. And then they do the tenant selection, and then we verify the incomes that they're eligible. And then we do charge a small compliance monitoring fee, and we have a third party that does the compliance monitoring annually.
So Santa Monica's inclusionary portfolio is about 150 50 developments at this point, and it's evolved, of course, over 30 years. So a large chunk of them, developers can self-select the tenants. I mean, we look at their they prepare a marketing plan and we okay that, but they self-select and then we confirm them on our through our audit process. And then the ones that have been developed in the last several years, when the law was changed, we have our own. The city has its own list, and so the units can only be filled through with folks from our list. So landlord will call us and say, I have an upcoming vacancy, and we'll give them, 3 names or 5 names or whatever the.
And that list is open?
We've tried different things. Right now, it's open. It's targeted to the moderate income folks. We're steering our folks that have vouchers to the extremely low and lower ones, but it's open. It's open now. Anybody else?
We have a closed list. We do everything in-house right now. LISA verification and certifications, and because our program has tripled and we're about to quadruple, I'm really looking at rethinking that. I don't think that we can continue in that model with the volume that we have.
We do have a Pasadena preference that the developers have to follow. So those who live and work in Pasadena have the highest priority, and followed by those who live in Pasadena, followed by those who work in Pasadena, and then anybody and their brother after that, if the unit's not already oversubscribed 100 times by then.
I know that HUD funds the project-based and tenant-based vouchers, but I was wondering if there's any mechanism to use some of it in lieu funds to increase the supply of project-based or tenant-based vouchers? Or if that would be possible?
Yeah, the project-based rental assistance. Thanks. Rental assistance is an ongoing need, and inclusionary is a one-time fee. So it's not a good match. It's better for capital rather than for rental assistance.
Yeah, rental assistance is the gift that keeps on right here, and then we'll go back there.
So on that sort of same note, do any of you have concerns about the effectiveness of your programs in dealing with the sort of affordable housing crisis with respect to focusing on income and not also assets? And are you aware of any programs that have set up restrictions that look at both a potential tenant's assets as well as their income? Because anecdotally, I have heard of people exiting college with, significant parental assets and very low incomes getting access to affordable units. That seems like a very unfortunate use, in my opinion, of those resources. So I'm wondering.
Okay, no, your question's a really good one, and it's valid. The easy answer is the definition of gross household income includes assets, and so say somebody has $150,000 of assets, you have to multiply that. Generally, this is a California government code definition of gross income. You have to take those assets and multiply them by 10%, which in that case would be $15,000, and add it to their income. So that's the blanket easy answer. Your parental question comes up all the time in inclusionary housing programs that I administer. And I'm like Inspector Clouseau. So, I mean, I'm out there going, well, wait a minute, didn't your dad just send you to Tahiti? Literally, that is a real example. And so, but it is a really important part in administration, and this discussion today was about setting them up, but 100% your administration of who's getting these units and what kind of effective income they have is a really important issue for you to consider. But I would say when you're setting it up, be sure to use that California Government Code definition of income. Anybody else?
I would just add that one of the things we are seeing is folks completing college, getting out there in the marketplace, and they don't have enough income to rent even an inclusionary unit. So what we kind of alluding to what Kathy said, we said, well, you're looking at this $900 unit and your income is $1,100. How does that work? To come to find out, families parents are providing monthly, donations or stipends, and so we do our best to record what that actually is, and then that's counted as income. But
Yeah, the point is, it's all sources of income is what the eligibility is based on.
Anything to get your kids out of the house.
Didn't say that.
So we do one thing, I'm not sure if the other programs do this as well, but you can earn, once you move in, you can't earn over 100% of that income level. However, you can earn up to 150% of it for 2 years before you then have to move out of the unit. And so you don't end up moving into the unit and then staying there as your wealth increases. After 2 years, you would move and the unit would be available to someone else.
That's just for rental, right?
It's for rental, right. I should mention our whole program is rental. Okay, so I
Once
think
you're in,
if-
oh, I'm sorry,
oh,
if I
go
can
ahead,
finish.
Ted.
Once you're in ownership, you're good for life.
So I think this is time for the last question. Unfortunately, we don't have enough time, so we'll ask that one back there, and then we'll do sidebar discussions after that.
My question is this: when we lost the redevelopment plan back in 2008, I understood that the state was losing a lot of money with the program. Is the state providing enough funds to help us build affordable housing now that things are more expensive?
No comment. There's a videotape back there. But we can talk offside. You know, the state's really stepping up its game. It was giving a lot more local control over. The governor came in and rescued those funds because those funds were being misused in lots of circumstances, so he decided just to take it away. And then cities and counties that reach out to the state that are doing things right are getting that funding. We have ongoing negotiations with City of West Hollywood and City of Santa Monica and helping get some of those funds back in 2014, I think, or 13 it was. They had contracts that they already started on some of those funds, so I think between the two cities they got about $200 million back between just these two cities. So we realized that was a big damper for affordable housing, but we're looking at other creative ways to make sure that when we do start seeing those funds again, they're being used the properly way for affordable housing. And then again, just a last comment, just do your part. Really just talk to your elected officials, do all the housing advocate stuff. It's great, you get so much information. I always go to these amazing forums and I try to tell friends, be like, go to a Santa Monica City Council member and give that support for that project, because I guarantee you, Kathy's going to have 150 people on the other side against the project. Yeah. So that's all I want to leave it with.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, I think you were kind of kidding, but not really. That one of the it took us a generation or more to get to where we are right now. It's going to take us a generation or more to get out of where we are right now. And one of the really telling slides of the day was Kathy's, where she talked about inclusionary programs delivering as much affordable housing as the low-income housing tax credit. And so, what we would all point at as sort of the traditional way to build our way out of the solution is has strong competition from sort of leveraging market sector capacity too. And so there are a bunch of other interesting and cool ways to do that also. So I'd like to conclude by thanking first of all of you for coming today. Each of the panelists for their great insight and hard work and getting ready and everything. So please take a minute to express our appreciation. As an administrative issue, I think I can commit to posting the slideshows on our website, scamp.org. And then lastly, and most importantly, thanks to Bill Wong for coming up with the concept and partnering with us to do this event today. Thank you so much.